there will be an agreement. It would simply be too embarrassing politically for everyone concerned, and of course the French, especially as the host, to have a second Copenhagen, to fail again. But the question is, what will the nature of the agreement be, and what will the content of the agreement be? The parties have said that they are committed to producing a treaty or a convention or some other kind of legally binding document. But it's unlikely it will be an ordinary treaty or a convention. Why? Because for one thing, it's almost out of the question that the US Senate would ratify a treaty or a convention. So the US, as one of the two most important greenhouse gas emitters, would not be legally bound. Key provisions of this agreement will contain these pledges, which are being called INDCs. So these are intended nationally determined contributions. So each of the countries, and almost all the countries have now done so, have made pledges saying, we are willing to say that we will undertake in our country to do some particular actions regarding climate change. So the US, for example, has pledged 26% reductions over 2005 levels by 2025. The Chinese, on the other hand, have said that we will try to make sure that we reach peak greenhouse gas emissions no later than 2030. When you add up all these pledges, what do you get? And the general sense is that if we add up all these pledges, we will get about half of the reductions in emissions needed to meet the generally agreed goal of preventing temperature from increasing on the surface of the Earth more than 2 degrees centigrade. Well, let me go back a step or two. What else would the agreement say? So in addition to the pledges, the INDCs, there will be certain provisions about monitoring and reporting, and perhaps more importantly, there will be provisions about funding. So the funding issues are really critical in the sense that many countries, particularly in the developing world, say we would be willing to make pledges to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, but economic development is our top priority. Bear in mind that the pledges are also voluntary. The parties have not agreed to any kind of enforcement mechanism. They are simply saying, we are making these pledges, we will do our best to meet these pledges, but of course there's a long road between paper, what we call moving from paper to practice. Would the rich countries be willing to make some commitment to provide financial contributions, funding to help the developing countries to meet their commitments without sacrificing their effort to develop their economies? So in Copenhagen in 2009, the wealthy countries said that they would try to increase their financial contributions to dealing with climate change to a level of $100 billion a year over a period of 3 years. Well, it didn't happen in the period between Copenhagen and now. That's the last 6 years. But the issue is on the table again. And so the question is, what will be in the agreement regarding these financial issues? Will there be a serious effort to get up to $100 billion a year? Well, this is a very tricky issue because it really depends on how you count contributions, how you slice and dice the money. So, for example, I heard the president of France a month ago in a speech say, we're making progress. We think we're already up to $60 billion a year in commitments. And we're making a good faith effort to push this up closer to the $100 billion. But the question is, how much of this, in the terminology that we use, is new and additional money, and how much of it is simply putting new labels on things that we've been doing already, and therefore not coming up with additional commitments of money. And the fact of the matter is that the new and additional funding is much less than $60 billion a year. So this is going to be one of the real sticking points in these negotiations as far as the large number, 120 or 30 developing countries are concerned. If they're going to sign on to this agreement, what do they get in return? I think that the real question then becomes whether or not this agreement triggers a process over the coming years in which we can really move forward in ratcheting up the commitments. I mean, if we say Paris is the first installment, but it's just the first installment, and we're going to now make a focused and energetic effort year on year to move the commitment up, then it may begin to seem quite serious. If, on the other hand, it takes years, possibly 5 or 10 years for the agreement to enter into force, to become legally binding, and if in the meantime the political system within key countries like the United States changes in ways that are not positive or friendly with respect to climate change, then we will be disappointed. How likely is it that we will look back in 10 years, 20 years' time and see Paris as a turning point? Things really began to change. And I think that this is fundamentally a question of whether we can find a way to join together top-down efforts and bottom-up efforts. Top-down efforts are the international diplomacy, the diplomats, the negotiators meeting in Paris and trying to hammer out mutually acceptable language of an agreement. That's important. Can't get along without it. But bottom-up is the social movement, the groundswell of popular sentiment, the sense that enough is enough, and people coming to acknowledge that making real progress on climate change will require significant alterations in our lifestyles in the developed countries. That's not to say when we look back 20 years or 30 years from now, we'll say we have a lousy life. We had to sacrifice, we had to give up the good life. But it will mean that if we're successful, if we're serious, that we will have had to redefine what it means to have a good life, to have a happy life, a satisfying life, a sense of well-being, which will be defined in fundamentally less materialistic terms. I mean, I have to say, I think this time we really may be leaving succeeding generations between a rock and a hard place. let's hope they have the good sense, intelligence, creativity, and ability to engage in social as well as technical innovation to respond appropriately.